So apparently, because there are scary animals that can kill people, this proves there is no God. Well, that is according to a video I happened to see recently. It was in my YouTube recommendations, and it said 5 animals that disprove God. And I thought that was very intriguing, that there's this idea that there are 5 animals that you could look at that would actually disprove the existence of God. I do believe in God, but I'm willing to listen to what other people say about things like this. I actually find it very intriguing. And it's interesting, the video starts out with, well, which God are we talking about? And I find this is something you see a lot in especially circles that are really promoting atheism. When they will argue with atheists, they will say, well, we've abandoned so many other gods in the past, so why is it that you're holding to this one particular God? What they often fail to recognize is that when it comes to the God of the Bible, he actually is in a separate category, even by ancient people's standards. What the people of the Bible were writing about is that the other gods really didn't count as true gods because they were just idols made by people. Whereas the God they were worshiping was different. He was the eternal creator God, the one who is truly over all things, in control of all things. So that's a completely separate category than all those other gods that a lot of atheists and people of ancient times were talking about. But anyway, this video creator does ultimately pinpoint the God of the Abrahamic religions. So you could say the God of the Bible is what he's talking about here. And he picks out a few traits about God that he sees as being traits that apply to these different religions and their beliefs about God. What I noticed, though, is that he does definitely leave out some key aspects of God's nature. So right off the bat, you can see that the God he's disproving is the God that fits these particular attributes. But he doesn't give all the attributes of God. And there are even attributes that whether someone is Jewish or Christian or whatever, if they believe in the God of the Bible, it's more than just the attributes that he gives there in that video. But one thing I will say right off the bat here about his presentation, and I think it's important to note, as I discovered who this person is more, I realized that they were formerly a Jehovah's Witness. So I really think that frames his perspective on this whole issue that he's talking about, and even his perception of God himself. He's really looking at it from the lens of how he was taught things as a Jehovah's Witness. And my comment on that is that the Jehovah's Witnesses do not really represent the overall Christian perspective on many different things. And so I do think that skews his presentation and the way that he's thinking of Christianity when he talks about these things. I have a lot of disagreements myself with the Jehovah's Witness teachings and how they represent God. So I think that needs to be said right off the bat. But I noticed, and there are so many things that you could point out about the arguments he's making about these 5 different animals, but really a couple of things stood out to me. The first is that he had an issue with animals and young earth creationism. He has this issue with the animals he's talking about and young earth creationism. And he references answers in Genesis, I think, a few times in this video. And again, he's coming at it from a certain background. And my first reaction to what he's saying here about young earth creationism and answers in Genesis particularly is that not everybody is going to agree with answers in Genesis. And some people, I will say, find answers in Genesis more convincing than others. I'm not here in this video to really make a judgment on that. I know some people watch their stuff a lot, read their stuff a lot. I know people who do, and they find it very convincing. Other people don't find it as convincing. What I will say is this, that our faith fundamentally rests not on a certain ministry. Our faith rests on the idea that God is the one who is creator. And Christians throughout history, and even before Christianity, different people who were believers in ancient times probably did have different perspectives on the particulars of how God created. In other words, what did it actually look like? When did it take place? When you read the Bible, what it does say, and this is the most important thing, is that God created the heavens and the earth. It does give 6 days of creation, but Christians have different perspectives on those 6 days of creation. And I'm not going to get into that in this video. The point is that the Christian view overall, and what our faith really rests in, is the idea that there is a creator. So when he takes issue with young earth creationism, he's really trying to poke holes. And he sees that what he sees with these animals in his mind doesn't fit with a young earth creationist point of view. The other thing I would comment, though, on that is that when you start to try to poke holes in one particular ministry's explanation, you really have to think about, well, what is it that you yourself are purporting? And when it comes to Darwinian evolution, the idea that there actually isn't a creator, there actually isn't an intelligent designer behind everything, and you look at all of these different animals, even the ones that he's talking about, you can see, even with like the snake, for example, that he talks about, there's a lot of complicated aspects to that creature's design, the way that that creature operates. And so many people have pointed out, even some very, very intelligent, scholarly professors, biologists, these types of people have said the idea of evolution without any kind of intelligence behind it has a lot of holes in it. So if you're going to point out holes in the argument of someone else, you have to take a look at, does your argument have holes? And I would say that purely naturalistic Darwinian evolution definitely has holes in it. Questions that are very difficult, and I would even say impossible to answer from a naturalistic perspective. I like how Dawkins himself even said that what they're trying to do in their work as scientists is to explain things that have the appearance of design. It looks like they're designed, but they're not really designed, is what he's saying, which I think is fascinating. Even he has to admit that it sure looks like it's designed, but he would say it's not. But there are questions that people like Dr. Stephen Meyer have raised. What about the information in the DNA? Where does that come from? In our experience of the world and everything that we look at, when we see information, we always see that information comes from an information source or a mind. But when we look at DNA, we're saying that information just somehow got there, that it has no real source to it other than nature itself somehow. Ultimately, if you kind of go down this hole long enough, you will have people who say, well, I don't really believe in God, but I do believe that the way nature operates ultimately is a lot like God, because it's kind of moving toward a goal, and you actually have all of these different complicated infrastructures in nature that bring about life. I mean, it just takes the place of God, but it ultimately gets back to that idea of, is there a creator? And so I could go on and on about this, but I think that there are clearly holes in the argument that says there's absolutely no intelligence behind everything. It just happened this way. So that's what I wanted to address in terms of his issue with animals and the idea of young earth creationism. But another thing he had an issue with is animals that are harmful killers. I think this is more the crux of this video, that his view of God, as I said, which leaves out a lot of attributes, but his view of God is that God is supposed to be loving and good and kind, and yet you have these animals that do horrible things, can even kill people. So I think what this clearly brings out is that what he's really having an issue with is this understanding of the nature of God. His understanding of the nature of God is definitely limited. It certainly doesn't reflect everything that the Bible teaches. And I would say that he really actually has a skewed perspective.
I personally can't help but just imagine the conversation going on in heaven between God and Jesus when creating these sorts of animals. Jesus turning to God saying, what are you doing? The venom you've provided for them is so powerful that if it comes into contact with a human, it can cause serious injury or death. And God just saying, well, I'm God. It's Yahweh or the highway.
So you can see when he's acting out there the idea of God the Father and Jesus talking about the creation of jellyfish, that he just has this skewed perspective of really the presentation the Bible gives about God. If you actually look at the Bible's presentation, you will see that ancient people believed not only these things that he lists in his chart, but also that God is a God who is to be feared. And I really believe that the ancient peoples had a much greater sense of this than people today obviously do. The idea that God is to be feared. If anything, that was kind of the primary thing in a lot of ancient people's thinking about not only the creator God, but even their false beliefs about other false gods. They actually had this heavy sense of fear. And I think they just sensed a lack of control in life. And so they wanted to somehow have control. And so they believed in these different gods, and they believed that they had to somehow do things in such a way that they wouldn't get in trouble with these different gods, and they could somehow get these gods to do things for them. So that is really kind of a false belief in a certain direction, but the idea of fearing God is clearly something that the ancient people thought heavily about. And when it came to the creator God, who is over all things, there was definitely a sense of the necessity to have a healthy fear of the creator. And so in the book of Proverbs, it says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. I also want to correct something here when he's talking about Jesus and God the Father. Jesus, who I would say God the Son, actually in the New Testament, for example, talks about people who will face judgment where there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. He talks about someone who offends a little one being thrown into the midst of the sea with a millstone tied to them. I mean, these are very harsh pictures of judgment that Jesus is talking about. So when he describes Jesus as being the nice one and God the Father as being the mean one, right there you see something that doesn't represent the biblical picture. Jesus himself talks about judgment. And so again, it's this idea of having a healthy fear, which I know a lot of people today buck against very strongly. But it reminds me of what C.S. Lewis said in the Chronicles of Narnia in reference to Aslan, where the children are talking about him. They're learning about Aslan, who represents Jesus. And they ask one of the other characters, is Aslan this lion who, when they first hear he's a lion, they're pretty scared. They say, is he safe? And the answer that I think it's the beaver that says this, no, he's not safe, but he is good. And I think it's the same idea in the Bible about God. And that's what seems to be missing in this presentation, is that God is the one who made all things. And yes, some of the things that we see in this world are very scary, disturbing. They're things that we don't really like to see, but they do show us an aspect of how God chose to create this world. And it is a deeper, more multifaceted idea of the nature of God than what this person is presenting. Yes, God does create fuzzy, soft animals that we can like, and maybe that does show us something about God speaking to the reality of warmth and joy and comfort and that experience that we have in our life. But also, there are things that God has created that are scary. Things like, I remember having a bat in my house flying around all over the place, and that was a very unpleasant experience for me. I don't really like to have bats flying around, and I think they're kind of icky animals, right? But there are things in nature that just speak to a God that we just look at that stuff and, maybe some people like this person would say, ugh, I can't stand it. But I just look at it and say, it's fascinating. And doesn't it show that God creates things in such a variety of ways? And yes, there's even a sense of fear. When you think of even nature with storms, I love to watch tornado videos. I don't know why. It's always fascinating to me to see people with their cell phone filming these huge storms up close. And I kind of feel bad that they're putting themselves at risk, but there's part of me that actually enjoys watching that for some reason. And I think it's because of that sense of awe that sense of fear you get when you look at that. So God has clearly created things in nature to reflect different aspects of who he is. So when you really look at all of the things that he's saying in this video, my overall assessment is that in no way do his arguments disprove God. All it really does is just disprove his particular view of God, and I would say it's a very limited and ultimately isn't reflective of everything that the Bible teaches. So this happens a lot. People will say, well, I'm going to disprove something, but they don't actually disprove the thing itself. They just disprove their idea of that thing. And that happens here with his idea of God. He's not disproving God. He's disproving his false view of God. Remember, when it comes to the Bible, there was the sense of not only all these attributes that we might think are very positive, but there are also attributes of God that you could even say are fearful or terrifying. And that's what's great about reading these ancient writings in their fullness. If you read them, you'll see that in the Bible, these writers are grappling with very terrifying ideas at times. And what they come to the conclusion of, when you actually look at the whole of Scripture, is that there is a creator, and we have been made to worship this creator, to be in awe of this creator, to love this creator, to bow before this creator. And ultimately, because God is the creator and he gives us life, he has the right to do what he wants with life, and he is the ultimate judge. Many people have pointed out that humans have this innate sense of morality, and people will argue about where that comes from. I believe very strongly that if we are made in such a way that we sense the idea of needing to judge things as being good or wrong, as being just or unjust, that comes from somewhere. We have this overarching sense of morality, and it comes from the moral lawgiver, the true judge. So God is the judge, is what the Bible's saying. And then it says that Jesus was sent for a particular purpose. God in Christ Jesus came to this earth to reconcile the world to himself. We have been alienated from God, and we experience the results of that in so many ways, right? There's so much in our hearts that is not right. But Jesus came to reconcile us to God, to bring us back to God, and to be in right relationship with our Creator. And then ultimately there is a judgment to come, where God will judge all things. And those who are in Christ Jesus have salvation. Those who are outside of belief in Christ experience judgment. That's ultimately the picture that the Bible's giving. But he concludes this video with talking about two different ways of thinking, and he kind of pits this idea of scientific thinking versus religious thinking. The problem, though, with this dichotomy that he's drawing here is that there are, first of all, many religious people who are great scientific thinkers. And some people would say, yeah, but that's because they're setting aside their religion. Well, not necessarily. There can be definitely a lot of scientific thought that can also tie into what a person thinks about religious issues. But aside from that, and this is probably even more important and kind of ironic, there are a lot of scientifically minded people who actually have a lot of agendas and, very unfounded presuppositions in their thinking, where if you actually try to explain something to them and give them evidence, they may not really be open to that. And I'm talking about on scientific issues themselves. You have scientists who sometimes will argue with other scientists, and they're not very open to evidence. And so there are actually elements within the scientific community, even in a secular sense, where it almost begins to mimic aspects of religious thought, where there are orthodoxies that you are never supposed to overstep those bounds and say anything different. So I think that it's really fallacious and overly simplified to say that there are two ways of thinking when it comes to science and religion and pitting those against each other. There are definitely very scientifically minded people who maybe even are atheists who actually reflect a lot of very barricaded type thinking where they're not really open to evidence, especially on certain issues. The final part of this video, he actually kind of displays something that I think is very important, and I want to really conclude with this. He shows, for example, Stephen Fry arguing against the idea of God being good, and how Stephen Fry is saying there that he would really have some issues he would want to take up with God if he were to face him. By the way, I've actually done a video addressing that particular issue where Jordan Peterson actually confronts Stephen Fry on that whole topic. It's very interesting. So I encourage you to check out that video. But I think what this displays is a certain kind of an attitude, a certain kind of a bitterness that people have. And as I said, this person was Jehovah's Witness. And honestly, I feel kind of sad. I think Jehovah's Witness, from what I understand about their organization, from what I've seen, it is very controlling in many ways. And I'm not trying to be harsh. I'm just trying to be honest. But because it's very controlling, it can be very hard for people in settings like that to deal with trying to answer questions and raise any kind of question that might challenge the authority of the Jehovah's Witness organization. And I think that's actually really not a good thing. I do not think that the Jehovah's Witness organization is really reflective, first of all, of Orthodox Christian teaching, but also the way in which we carry out that teaching. I do believe it's a very controlling kind of setting. And so I feel really bad for people in this. But there is this bitterness, and I understand bitterness toward people who have been overly controlling. But the idea of bitterness toward God is where we really have to take a step back and look at why do we have the attitude that we have. And I think the main point I want to make here, even though so much could be said about all of this, is that there are always issues behind the arguments that are being given. There's always something underneath the arguments that we see on the surface. And so when someone is arguing against God, for example, it may not ultimately be about whether they believe God exists or not. Yes, that's part of it, but another thing might be that maybe they've had some bad experiences that they're really hurting from. So we sometimes have to get behind the surface, what they're arguing about, and find out what is it they're dealing with underneath. Now, there are many people who they just have bitterness toward God, and it's because of hurts in their life or because they think things are unfair or unjust, and so they just have a hard time coming to that place of saying, I'm going to allow God to do what he wants to do, even if I don't understand it. By the way, the book of Job addresses that whole issue in great detail. And Job comes to the place of actually saying, yes, I will accept that God does things for a purpose I don't understand, and I will worship him even though I don't always understand things. Job came to a good place, and I think it's actually wonderful, and we come to a sense of true joy and peace and fulfilling our purpose when we can accept God's place and prerogative on things. But a lot of people do have an attitude, and I think you see that in this video. And so when people are giving arguments, it's easy to think we have to just tell them, okay, if I can counter your argument here, then you're going to believe everything I believe. But I think what you have to remember all the time is there are things underneath the arguments that people are actually presenting. There might be other things that you need to talk with people about and address beyond the arguments that they're giving themselves. So for this person, clearly, I would love to have a discussion with them. And if they ever want to come on my channel and talk about these things, I invite you to come on to talk about your experience with the Jehovah's Witnesses and what that was like. And I would say, for me personally, I would want to contrast what the Bible teaches and my experience with Christianity with what the Jehovah's Witnesses particularly teach and how they function. And to me, that's a whole issue in and of itself beyond what he's arguing about here. Ultimately, though, does he disprove the existence of God by presenting these 5 animals? I would say hands down, no. He doesn't disprove the existence of the true God, the biblical God. He only disproves the existence of his own particular view of God, which I would say is actually very anemic, very limited compared to the overall biblical presentation. All right, there was a lot there, and I hope that it was interesting and helpful on some level to you. I would love to hear any comments, thoughts that you have. Put those in the comment section below. But thank you so much for taking some time to listen to my thoughts on this subject, brought to you from A Frisch Perspective.